been ramping up its rhetoric in recent weeks, using a new UN Security Council resolution and a joint military exercise between the U.S. and South Korea as justification. The path to peace certainly seems far away. To help us find it again, we are joined by reporter Zeb Eckert of Bloomberg TV. Mr. Eckert, thank you very much for being here today. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Let's begin with why you're here. Actually, your relationship with Korea. You've been here a number of times to cover a number of events, the 2010 G20 summit being one. A year later, you were here to cover the death of Kim Jong-il. Your perspectives as a newsman, your perspectives from afar of the Korean Peninsula, what are they?
Well, it's one of the most unique situations in the world, of course, and the fact that the DMZ remains the most heavily militarized border in the world tells you a lot about what's going on. I think we had a relatively quiet period over the past year or so, but now, just in recent months, as you well know, the situation has gotten much more severe. And the question, I guess, now is whether this rhetoric can go any further or whether this will actually lead to action by the North Koreans. I know in South Korea you're used to the unpredictability of all of this and life goes on, but I think the rest of the world is quite concerned right now. And throughout the course of this week in South Korea, speaking to people in the financial industry and global leaders, they certainly are concerned. So I think it's a very critical time to be here and to talk about these issues because North Korea keeps everyone certainly on their feet.
And you're here as a moderator for the Asian Leadership Conference. Before we get into specifics of that, tell us a little bit about your involvement and what you're doing here.
Well, I'm here representing Bloomberg, of course, at the Asian Leadership Conference, and it's really a chance for people in government, certainly in finance, to come together and talk about big ideas. Number one, on where Asia goes from here, the Asian century. How do we keep a peaceful, especially Northeast Asia, how do we keep Northeast Asia peaceful and keep the economic growth engine moving? And also, I think a piece of that is sustainable growth, making sure that economic growth is inclusive. As you know, certainly many places in the Asia Pacific, the wealth gap is growing. That's an issue for social stability. Where I'm based in Hong Kong, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and this is a key challenge, social challenge and economic challenge. So those are the kind of issues we're talking about. And of course, the elephant in the room, which is North Korea and how the security situation in Northeast Asia evolves. Those are the main points of this event.
Let's talk about that elephant for a moment here. You mentioned that you get a sense that people are a bit more concerned this time around, the people you're talking to. What sort of sense are you getting from the participants?
Well, it seems that the fact that North Korea has ratcheted up the rhetoric quite significantly. I mean, now we're getting pronouncements every single day from North Korea, whereas they may have in the past gone silent for months at a time. The question is, what do they want this time? And it all seems to be in response to these toughened UN sanctions. China now appears to have less tolerance for the threats coming out of North Korea. But the diplomatic path forward is really the key challenge. And I don't think anyone has the answers at this stage. I know it's a challenge for President Park and the new administration here, especially since she campaigned on more engagement with North Korea. So does she go back on a campaign promise? How does she appear in terms of her engagement and her strength against the North Korean regime? And then it's a complicated question for the U.S. and China as well. You know, there's deep-seated historical regional issues at play here. It's not just a nuclear threat that everyone seems to talk about.
But the people you're talking to sort of behind the scenes and I guess in front of the scenes as well are indicating to you that this feels a bit differently as compared to the past rhetoric that normally comes out of the North? They feel a bit different.
They do. And in fact, at one of our panel discussions at this event this week, the former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd said he was deeply disturbed by the most recent nuclear test by the North. He says he was disturbed because he thinks it's the #1 security risk to the Asia Pacific, and he said it could possibly be the #1 security risk to the world. That's a big statement, given everything that's happening in the Middle East, global terrorism, the fact that he considers North Korea, a nuclear North Korea, to be a major threat. That gets your attention and certainly shows that global leaders are concerned about this.
You work for Bloomberg TV, which has an economic slant, and then you've mentioned that that's one reason you're here this week to talk about those issues. I do wonder, when you're reporting on North Korea and these North Korea issues, do you sort of approach it from that angle? Are you looking at it in a way how it might affect the economic world, or how might you report it differently as compared to other media?
Well, Bloomberg is a business and financial news channel, so we do less general news than other networks might do. We do tend to look at the economic angle of things. But the interesting thing to us, as we look at the data, is that there's really no market impact to the threats from North Korea, even after the most recent nuclear test. You see the Seoul Kospi, the stock market. It declines that day. The next day it rebounds. And in fact, defense stocks in this country rally, the main defense companies, defense equipment makers. So there's really sort of a perverse market reaction to a very severe threat. And I think it just goes to show the fact that people in this country live with this every day, are used to it. And on a very positive angle, I think people here are very, very resilient, which says a lot about South Korea.
It's certainly a bit of numbness as these threats come out, and they've come out for years and years, of course. The international community, however, looks at this situation a bit differently. We were talking a bit earlier. The international community looks at the situation on the Korean Peninsula and sees a real threat there and is a bit worried. What's your sense when you look at that reaction of how the international community is sort of viewing the situation here?
Again, there's kind of a disconnect because people in this country go about their lives, they do business, you have a thriving economy, yet 40 miles to the north you have a border with the military dictatorship that's volatile and unpredictable. I think that the rest of the world is rightly concerned about a nuclear North Korea. That's not only a threat to South Korea, it's a threat to regional security. North Korea continues to threaten U.S. military interests, saying it will target bases in Japan, Guam, Hawaii. As you know, they've threatened and said they had the missile capability to reach the west coast of the United States. So if they in fact have that missile capability and they develop the expertise of a nuclear warhead, that's a major concern. So a nuclear North Korea from the perspective of the United States and the West cannot be allowed. The question is, are they there yet, and what actions can be taken before that to stop it?
President Park Geun-hye is trying to come up with measures to stop these nuclear provocations, as is the rest of the international community. When you look at her approach, she has mentioned that she is open to dialogue if North Korea should make the right choices. Do you see that as the best possible scenario, the best possible step moving forward?
It's unclear at this stage because the U.S. has tried this approach multiple times. When North Korea wants something, when they want food in particular for their millions of starving people, they will come to the table and talk. But as Colin Powell told me the other day, they're the best negotiators in the world. He said he's never met better negotiators, and they will work very hard to get what they want. But then once they get what they want, they will retrench. And I think that's a major concern, specifically for your president. How do you engage with this very hostile neighbor to the north? So she has to tread a very fine line, tread very carefully, needs to appear strong, of course, defensively, for the sake of the South Korean people. Of course, there needs to be strong defenses in the case that there is an attack. But you don't want to provoke the North into an attack with your response. So I think you see very restrained comments out of the Blue House and certainly out of the government, the defense ministry here. And I think that's the appropriate approach. And certainly the South Koreans are being counseled on this by the United States. They're hearing from China, Japan, and others who have an interest in this.
Former Secretary of State Colin Powell, of course, is well aware of the threat here. What types of things did he suggest should be done moving forward?
Well, he said that this is an international issue. It's one of international concern. And he gave me a very interesting anecdote as we chatted. He said, North Korea knows that if it takes a dramatic action, that has significant consequences for Seoul, for the South, there will be a very strong and very harsh response from the United States and, of course, from the South Koreans. They know that if they take that step, it will likely be the end of their regime. And for Pyongyang, it's all about preservation of the regime. So they will take the temperature up right to the point that the pot of water is about to boil over, and then they will ease off. He, in fact, Colin Powell, did not seem terribly concerned that this would escalate into armed conflict, into actual violence. Now, there are concerns, of course, about a Chonan-style bombing, targeting South Korean warships, military assets, or an attack on Yeonpyeong Island, or another one of those islands near the border. That is a possibility. But in his sense, and certainly from what I'm hearing, a large-scale attack would be highly unlikely. But unpredictable. That's how the North Koreans are.
We never know, that's for sure. I want to talk a little bit about the recent developments, one being the contingency plan that recently came out, the agreement between Korea and the U.S. If there is a provocation from the North, South Korea would lead, the U.S. would provide support. That is a new development here. I'm curious what the reaction has been overseas. I know you're based in Hong Kong, but the reaction there as well as in the U.S. to that development.
Well, people in Hong Kong and I think around the Asia Pacific watch this North Korea issue very, very carefully. It's a concern to them. They do not want nuclear North Korea, and certainly conflict on the Korean Peninsula. The fact that you have the South Korean military and the United States Armed Forces articulating what the response would be shows that this conflict has gone to a new level. Certainly in the past they've had plans, silent plans, if you will, plans in the background, but the fact that these are now public to some extent, and we understand that they've taken these talks to a different level, shows that they're very concerned. And I think, more importantly, it sends a message to North Korea that, look, we're prepared, so don't test us.
You are in Hong Kong, you are on the ground there. We've seen China, it seems like they're growing more and more impatient with Pyongyang as these provocations, these nuclear tests, missile tests keep popping up. What is your sense, being in Hong Kong, of how the Chinese government is now reacting to the developments in the north?
Well, I think you've seen a stronger response from the Chinese to the most recent nuclear test. Clearly, they were not pleased. But I think it's important to keep all of this in context, because while China does not want to see a nuclear North Korea is very vital to China for various reasons. And preserving the status quo, preserving the regime in Pyongyang is paramount for multiple reasons, historical reasons, of course, and keeping a buffer between China and Japan, South Korea, and the United States for that reason. So it's a very fine line, and I think the United States has worked for a long time, many, many decades, to try to convince the Chinese that it's in their long-term interests to evolve their North Korea policy, that maybe supporting the regime forever is not the best approach. However, I think this has fallen on very deaf ears in Beijing, and I read an article recently that the Chinese will not even entertain talks with the Americans on contingency plans if the North Korean regime falls. What happens to the refugees? What happens to the borders? I think these are very critical issues, very sticky issues that still have no answer.
You're welcoming in a new administration in China, Xi Jinping, of course, the new president there. Is there any sense that he is going to sort of change the tide, take a different path in China right now?
Well, he's claimed to be a reformer, and certainly there's an ambitious reform agenda by the National People's Congress and the leadership there as part of the new 5-year plan. So they've got very specific targets. One is to double per capita income by 2020. So raising the living standards of ordinary Chinese, that's very important for maintaining social stability, which is the #1 priority of the Chinese Communist Party. No matter what anyone tells you, they must maintain social stability, and they do that by providing and promoting strong economic growth, raising incomes, lifting millions of people out of poverty, which, by the way, I think is a great success story of the Chinese. They should be commended for that, because how many countries in the world have been able to do that and maintain a population of 1.3 billion people? Look at India, very different case. It is a democracy, yet wealth is not rising in India at the same pace as it is in China. So they are to be commended. They've got a long way to go. Financial market reforms are part of this, opening up to global investors, converting the currency to be based on market exchange rates, and then political reforms not to mention human rights reforms to give Chinese people more freedoms and the ability to function as human beings, if you will, as people do in other countries.
Getting back to the North Korea issue, amongst the Chinese public, I've seen various articles and various comments on Weibo, for instance, sort of expressing their frustration with Kim Jong-un and the leadership there. Is there a change in tide in the the Chinese public as it pertains to Pyongyang? Are they growing impatient as well?
I think that's less clear. Perhaps it depends on who you ask in China and where they live. So those closer to the North Korean border, perhaps in northeast China, may have a more evolved view of this because it affects them disproportionately. Those in Canton and Guangzhou and Shenzhen in southern China probably don't care as much about these issues. I think that there are clear questions about if the North Korean regime falls, what would that mean for the North Koreans who would immigrate into China? How would China absorb them? There are questions now as to what happens if a North Korean woman defects and moves to China, marries a Chinese man and has a child. My understanding is that that child lives in has a stateless existence. It's not Chinese, not North Korean. So there are clear questions on matters of law and matters of policy here that have to be resolved. And China has a long way to go in terms of addressing those.
You brought up human rights. Of course, human rights are a huge concern in North Korea as well. The UN Human Rights Council recently created a commission of inquiry. They're going to look into human rights abuses in North Korea. This is something that the international community has been pushing for quite some time now. Your thoughts on this, and are you among the people who think that, yes, it's nice in theory that this is happening, but really no progress is going to be made?
Well, I think it's important that they address the issue. It's far better than ignoring the issue. We know that there are widespread human rights abuses in North Korea by the regime. Food aid, money for food that should be going to starving people is going to enrich uranium and support, as I understand it, large-scale drug production, which is exported and contributes to drug problems around the world. These are major, major issues. So the North Koreans have chosen a path of manufacturing illegal narcotics, manufacturing weapons, significant large-scale weapons, and developing its own arsenal in favor of taking care of its people, even though the regime tells its people that it has their best interest in mind. So it's important that the UN and other organizations look at this issue, work on this issue, because as long as people in North Korea are starving and dying, it cannot be ignored.
From a foreign reporter's perspective, when you look at the Korean Peninsula, you've mentioned it's an exciting thing to report on. What do you think is the sort of most exciting or most interesting thing about the Korean Peninsula, maybe aside from North Korea even, when you look at the story here? What sort of jumps out to you when you look at Korea in general?
Well, the North Korea, South Korea story is fascinating and will continue to be. But I want to put this in perspective because North Korea is an isolated military dictatorship, and I believe it will see its last days at some point. I can't say whether that will be this year, 10 years, or 20 years from now, but nothing lasts forever. So I think that that story is going to evolve. I think the more important story, and the story that investors focus on, and certainly the story that we focus on a lot at Bloomberg, is the fact that South Korea is an economic success story. It's an economic miracle. Look at where this country has come in just a few decades. The fact that millions of people as well have been lifted out of poverty. Education, the system is among one of the best and most rigorous in the world, certainly. You have world-class companies, the Samsungs, the Hyundais of the world. You have a thriving stock market, a democracy where protests, of course, are welcomed and frequent on a variety of issues. And the fact that you have such resilience in the people here and determination says a lot about South Korea. Come what may, even with all the threats from the North, I know that there is a strong road ahead for a strong and bright future for this country. Even with the current economic downturn, I think it's temporary. These currency issues with the yen and the won, they will be worked out. I think the path forward is bright.
You mentioned the progress, you mentioned the path forward being bright. Is there a lesson in there that the international community can learn from other countries? When they look at Korea, what sorts of lessons do you think they should take?
Well, I think one of the key lessons that the world should look at, and students of history would understand this, again, is the resilience. The fact that the Korean people have worked so hard, have built such an amazing country with a world-class airport, the biggest consumer electronics company in Asia, Samsung, a stock market that has grown in size and scope and diversity and liquidity over the past number of years. The world can take a lot of lessons from this, to work hard and see your dreams fulfilled. That's the story, and I think education is a big part of it. I know it's very important here. I know Korean families take it very seriously, and you see the rewards, you see the payoffs. Companies like Samsung and Hyundai and LG and POSCO and all of these guys, Hyundai Heavy Industries, they don't get to where they are in terms of global corporate leaders without strong education and without a lot of determination. So I think that's a great lesson for the rest of the world. It's certainly something I'm reminded of every time I come here.
I noticed you didn't bring your crystal ball with you, but I'm going to ask you a crystal ball question anyway. We're sitting here in Seoul. We're in between China, we're in between Japan, of course, and all of these global powers. Kevin Rudd said this was a tinderbox on water, essentially these territorial conflicts and historical conflicts that are popping up. If you were to look ahead to the next few years in terms of the conflicts, in terms of economic relationships, in terms of everything, really, where do you see the region going as a whole? What is your sort of outlook on the Asia-Pacific region here?
Well, I think the 21st century, as has been widely written, is the Asian century. I think that economic prosperity story continues. I think the regional conflicts that have dominated the headlines in recent months must be kept in perspective. These will be worked out eventually. History, historical wounds certainly plays a role here. Nationalism, rising nationalism in certain countries plays a role. And what is most important at the end of the day is that governments continue to talk to each other, that there are no misunderstandings that could lead to an escalation of conflict, say in the waters in the East China Sea, in the South China Sea certainly, between Japan and Korea. There needs to be constant dialogue to make sure that even if there are disagreements, and there always will be, that they don't reach that fever pitch where one mistake could lead to armed conflict in the region. No one wants to see that. I don't believe China, Beijing, Seoul, Tokyo, none of these capitals want to see that kind of conflict in the region. They know that it would be devastating to the economy, and I don't think it's going to happen. I think the growth story continues and we work it out, but perhaps I'm just an optimist.
That's not a bad thing to be in this region. Zeb Eckert, we do appreciate you being here today and providing your insights. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, as always, for watching. We'll see you next week after 10.